Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was requested by Eddie Stardust. I hope you'll enjoy listening. Eddie Stardust says, Parley, I say. I would like your help with building a so-called Sunforger package for my Naya, Marath, Will of the Wild, Elder Dragon Highlander deck in Magic the Gathering. I've been tinkering with this deck since September 2022, and I'm fairly happy with it, but recently I've begun questioning my removal and Sunforger synergistic cards. Having taken a closer look at the cards I had included in my deck, it feels like it's just a pile of 10 red or white removal cards, or the spells are green and thus not fetchable. I would therefore like some help fine-tuning this package to be much more versatile while still being as synergistic with my deck as possible. The deck that I'm playing is a high-power Naya combo deck built around the commander Marath, Will of the Wild. I want to stress that this is a high-powered list, so the cards included have to be very efficient and very widely applicable. You can take out or leave in any card you want, and you don't have to take budget into consideration. If possible, I would like all the cards included to be useful in all matchups. In essence, while cards like Pyroblast are very useful for both protecting my combo pieces and being a very efficient piece of removal, I've also had matchups where I did not have a single target for these spells, but feel free to debate their inclusion should you like. And I do like. The plan of attack for the deck is to ramp in the early game, try to establish a chokehold for the other players in the mid game, and ultimately accrue the correct combo pieces to delete the other player's life totals in the late game. I play in quite mixed settings, both against other combo decks but also decks that rely on attacking, thus I need the package to be as versatile as possible. I've included a selection of possible includes in the maybe board, but do note that it does not have to be any of these cards. Feel free to suggest anything. The deck list can be found here. We'll go over it. In summary, renew my Sunforger package. You can take out any card you want, you can put in any card you want, no budget restrictions, as versatile a package as possible. And then you say something that makes me worried that I'm not sure we're going to be able to do. At minimum, a 10 card package. Okay, as you can see, there's 9 removal spells here in that group. No less than 10 pieces of card advantage, no less than 12 pieces of ramp, no less than 10 pieces of removal. But you can see that in the ramp category, you only have 3. So I gather that you want me to add a lot of cards, a lot of which are not related to Sunforger. I will try, but I'm going to prioritize the Sunforger part because that's the primary request. I doubt I will be able to fully fulfill that part of the request by the end. And note that this may not result in a linked deck list. Like I'm just going to give advice that you may need to apply yourself. But I'll do the best I can with the time I have. Okay. Whoa, a lot to take in. Let's break it down into smaller tasks. First, we need to understand the deck. We should probably start with the commander. And for people that are a little lost, if you don't play Magic and you're just listening to this for fun, I won't spend too much time on that, but this is an 100 card singleton. We only get 1 copy of each card besides lands, basic lands. But we always get this card. This card is always available. It's outside of the deck, so it can always be cast for progressively more mana, potentially. If it dies, it needs to be recast for more mana. We won't go into the commander rules right now, but playing commander EDH, we'll have this card always. The other cards are a big stack of 99, and no more than 1 copy can go in. They also all have to be only at most red, green, and white. So no cards that contain any blue or black, even if the deck can cast them, we're just not allowed to play them. That's one of the rules of the format. So here's the card. Let's read it. Marath is 3 mana, red, green, and white. Marath, Will of the Wild enters the battlefield with a number of 1/1 counters on it equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. So if killed and recast for a higher taxed cost, Marath will come back larger. And it says X, pay X mana, remove X 1/1 counters from Marath, and you can choose 1. Put that many counters on a target creature, do that much damage to any target, or put an XX elemental token onto the battlefield. Cool. Very versatile commander, a great toolbox. Fairly mana intensive. You definitely need a good amount of mana to do this. If you, say, wanted to do 3 damage to something, you need to cast Marath and then pay 3 mana more into the ability and kill your Marath to do that thing. Also note that if something is giving Marath +1/+1, like some kind of aura or something, or an enchantment, like a global effect, maybe an elemental tribal creature, Marath will not die from having all those counters removed because they'll have 1/1 or more base stats probably. So that's I don't know if that'll come up, but that's a thing. Now we should probably go into the deck list and figure out what it's meant to do. So we'll browse around here. This is the view I made for this task, so hope it's okay. And you can see some things. Sylvan Library, for example, is a pretty crazy card. You said no budget, and so there's some cards that immediately come to mind, like couldn't we put in, well, there's Mana Crypt. Um, more crazy ramp stuff. Now, to be honest with you, because I never play with these cards, I probably won't think of them. So if there's some super obvious but wicked expensive card that I don't think of, like, the good news is you know what it is, Honestly, I have no experience playing at that power level, so I will probably not think of those cards. But let's just take a quick tour through the deck and see what it's doing. I've noticed, for example, that every single card in this deck is available in the modern frame, which I restrict myself to when I play this format, but is not a rule of the format. I have also noticed that the maybe board is only cards in the modern frame. So, for example, like, we're not going to waste time recommending, like, obviously you should put, all of the alpha dual lands that cost like $400 into the deck. Like, sure, yeah, but you know that. If you really feel there's no budget whatsoever, but yeah, we're not going to worry about that too much. Okay. So yeah, for ramp, for example, we're gonna need to include some other things because you've got Mana Crypt, Smothering Tithe. I'm not sure I would entirely count, and Soul Ring, but you also have, for example, I see a lot of mana dorks like Avacyn's Pilgrim can definitely count, Arbor Elf can count, Elvish Mystic is in here, Fintorn Elves, some elves certainly, and definitely a lot of really powerful cards. You can see Dockside Extortionist. So you've got, yeah, there's a lot of ramp which you'll need, as you said. Bloom Tender, big bongo ramp. Really a lot of mana dorks. So maybe it's not as bad as I thought. You say no less than 12 pieces of ramp. There are a lot that you could count. Maybe you just meant you didn't want me to cut any. So again, we'll just keep digging through the deck. I probably need to understand what the combo is, but I don't. So that's a whole thing. But you asked me to do the removal. Maybe I'm biting off more than I can chew. Let's focus. The next thing we should probably look at is Sunforger. Because, as near as I can tell, this deck doesn't have any reliable way to get this. It's just a good card in the deck. Therefore, the thesis that I'm going to present for how we're going to modify the suite of removal is that we want to make sure not to over focus on Sunforger. We don't want to over focus on Sunforger because the deck doesn't have a way to reliably get it. You're not expecting to have it. In other words, it's fantastic when you get it. I also want to note that for it's always tricky when you say, I want to stress that this is a high-powered list, so the cards have to be very efficient and very widely applicable. That's always a very vague, that's not your fault, but always a very vague thing to say. This card seems too slow to me for like super competitive play. Now, you didn't say it was for, people call it CEDH, but my point is there's no definition really to any of those things that actually clarifies the situation. If you ask the CEDH people for a definition, they'll sure give you one, but it isn't one that actually clarifies like exactly what decks are what, because that doesn't exist. And so just to note that this is of a power level where Marath, Will of the Wild, and Sunforger are viable cards, which I would argue they are not at certain levels of play. They just cost too much mana to do what they do. It's too slow. Very, very good cards, but at an extreme level of play, there would be people who would say these cards are just too slow. So we're not infinitely worried, is I guess the point I'm trying to make. What does Sunforger do? It's a 3-mana equipment. You can equip it for 3. Creature gets 4 power when it's equipped. It's something. And you can pay red and white mana to unattach it, search for a red or white instant with converted mana cost 4 or less, and cast it without paying for it. Then you shuffle. So again, a lot of mana if you don't have a way to equip more cheaply. but it does give you an engine that lets you fetch spells out of your deck over and over. Once you have paid the 3 to play it, you can then equip it for 3 or hopefully less. We'll get back to that in a minute. And then pay the 2 to search for something and cast it. So a couple of things to note. What are the cards that Sunforger can fetch? Well, they have to be in red or white instants with a converted mana cost 4 or less. Now, are we happy if they're 1 mana? Well, you draw the card, so to speak, and it casts it for you. So you pay only 1 mana. If it's a 1 mana spell you find, you pay only 1 mana more, and then you get the effect out of your deck on command. So that's pretty good. I don't think you need to worry too much about like 1 mana spells with this card. But if they're 4 mana, you do get much better value. And note that this is its instance, and the effect is instant speed, so you can do things that counter stuff, which I think is an incredibly good idea, by the way. You definitely should do like things that counter stuff. So what kinds of things would be good here? Well, you want versatile stuff. One way to look at this is to make a toolbox, to make one card that's really, really good at destroying enchantments, or one card that's really, really good at destroying artifacts or whatever. But I think the first place to start is to include as many cards as possible that can kind of stop anything, that can answer anything, basically counter spells. And red and white have an amount of counter spells. Specifically, the card that comes to mind immediately for me is Mana Tithe, which I'm going to recommend. This card is tricky. This card is tricky because if you are playing at a certain power level, it probably won't do anything, but no one expects the Mana Tithe. It says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1, and it's a 1 mana white instant. I think that the concern in this deck is actually more that people will expect that you'll cast Mana Tithe. Like if you play Sunforger and your deck has Tybalt's Trickery and Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast, they're like, this guy plays Mana Tithe. You know what I mean? If they know about Mana Tithe, they're probably going to think, yeah, you play all the weird red and white counter spells. So let's just talk about those quickly, but I'm going to recommend Mana Tithe. I think that if you play at what you consider to be a very high power level, I think the thing that power level has in common, that general area of competitive play has in common, is that spells are cast very heavily on curve, and people are going for it really early. They're going to use every bit of mana they have. They're not going to waste any mana. They have tons of 1 mana plays, which means this is basically guaranteed to get value. And being able to cast a 1 mana spell that stops your opponent's, thing from going off, when your deck plans to combo out, you're maybe a little less aggressive, you're going to win a little less, is theoretically good. The problem with Commander, of course, is that you have usually 3 other opponents. Your Elder Dragon Highlander match consisting of 3 other people means that if you spend 1 card to stop your opponent's 1 card, your other 2 opponents are kind of better off, you could argue. You destroyed a third of a card against you and 2/3 of a card against your opponents, theoretically meaning that you actually made your opponents better off than you made yourself. Not only that, but you and the other opponent both exchanged, valuable cards, but the other 2 people at the table didn't have to do anything. They're just safe, and now they have, whatever they have. So there's some concern that the counter spells wouldn't be that good. However, you're trying to do a combo. So I think being able to constantly spit out things that stop your opponent from interrupting the combo is really good. This is why I think you definitely should play Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast. I'm going to argue that you should play these cards because they counter the things that make you lose. They may be useless in some matchups, but I would argue you should be favored to win those matchups. If your opponents don't have any interaction that can stop you from comboing off, you will win because the combo wins the game, or whatever it is, by the way. A lot in this parlay already. So I really think these should stay in. I think Mana Tithe should be in too. I think no one expects a Mana Tithe. And also, yeah, like counter spells are exactly where you want to be for 1-to-1 removal, because these can stop your opponents from doing a thing if you need them to make the game not immediately end. And they can also protect your stuff. That's very versatile. I probably don't need to sell it to you this much. So let's look at other stuff. You've got Tybalt's Trickery, you've got Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast, which are both more or less the same thing. Slight nuance, but let's not worry about it for now. And you've got Mana Tithe. If you added Mana Tithe, that's one of the cards I'm adding. Mana Tithe. So what else? Well, I think that if a card is going to be straight removal, it's got to be pretty efficient. For example, there's a card called, what is it called? Ashes? I don't really remember. It's 4 mana, and it destroys 2 artifacts or enchantments, potentially. But let's talk about card destruction first. So Generous Gift. It's 3 mana, destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 elephant. This is good in that it's very versatile. It hits anything. So in that sense, it's the kind of card you'd want in this package. But I'm not sure if that approach is a winning strategy for this deck. I'm not sure that this is a good way to go. Because if you do this, you're getting into a 1-to-1 fight that your deck isn't. I guess if you have the Sunforger and you have the mana, but again, if you're re-equipping it over and over again, then I'm not sure I like that, because you're paying 5 mana each time to just destroy one thing. That's just not that good, I don't think. I worry that even something like Path to Exile or Swords to Plowshares, I think these cards should be in the deck, but I don't think they're that good with Sunforger. In the type of table you're describing, it seems too sweaty for paying 2 to 5 mana to just destroy one creature. That's just not enough at that level. That's what I think anyway. I don't know. Chaos Warp though, I don't know. This maybe this one. It doesn't give them anything in return, which I feel like can be relevant. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield, but a lot of the time it will be a land. I think it hitting anything, unlike Path to Exile, which sort of does the same thing, is really good. So I don't know, like you have the good sort of universal removal cards. I'm just gonna question whether they are good in this deck. Here's the things that come to mind instead. Let's regroup a little bit. I've said what I don't know if I like. Basically single target removal like that. I kind of want that as counter spells in this case. Again, I think Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, you should maybe play these cards, but I'm not sure I'm that excited about them with Sunforger, and that's what you asked for. So 3 big things come to mind. Board wipes with Sunforger. I'm pretty confident that we can find some kind of probably red 3 mana board wipe. In fact, I think we can get a white one. Faded something or other. White. Oh no, that's 7 mana. Okay. But we might be able to find a white one, but I think there will be a red spell that is 3 or 4 mana that is an instant that damages everything on the board by like 2 or 3. That seems really good with Sunforger. That seems quite strong. Being able to wipe the board with your Sunforger seems incredible. Now, you won't have something to equip it to. And this brings me to my second, probably the biggest point. I wonder if we can finagle a way that Sunforger gives you bodies to equip it to by itself. Like you can fetch a card that makes the Sunforger have bodies to equip it to. You could simply have Sunforger fetch an instant that creates tokens. But I wonder if we can do better than that. Like, I kind of want a Sunforger, an effect you can get with your Sunforger that gives you an engine all by itself. So like the Sunforger can find you a card that makes the equip cost cheaper, something like that. The card that comes to mind, just as an example of this effect, would be something like Pure Steel Paladin. This says whenever an equipment comes enter the battlefield under your control, you draw a card, but when you have 3 or more artifacts, equipment you control have equip 0, which means that Sunforger goes from 5 per spell to 3 per spell, which is a pretty huge difference. Now, can I think of an easy way to get this card from using Sunforger? No, no. But my point is that a card like that seems relevant in here. For that matter, again, it's important not to focus too much on the Sunforger thing, but if we could find a card that made Sunforger better, that is an acceptable card in the deck overall, that seems advantageous. Now, you do have a lot of mana dorks, which is good for Sunforger, I think. It means you have a lot of bodies to equip it to, and you might argue that that makes the board wipes bad, but we might be able to find one that is more one-sided. What about something like Mizium Mortars? Let's look at that. The idea of this one is that you could maybe do like a workaround for Mizium Mortars deals 4 damage to target creature you don't control. Overload. Oh, but you probably can't cast it for its overload cost. Yeah, okay, never mind. But then I'm thinking of things like Slag Storm. I might just have to look up a bunch of board wipes, and we can do that. Let's do that. So the way I would proceed from here is I'm sure there is a card that is, a 3 or 4 mana, probably instant, probably red board wipe. But I can't remember one, so let's just go find it. So I'll go to, let's do it from the top. So I'll go to Scryfall, I'll hit Advanced Search. Commander is white, red, and green. We can only play those cards. Mana value has to be less than 5. It's got to be legal in Commander, and it needs to be an instant. And now I'm going to do deals damage, don't control. Is there a one-sided, it doesn't affect your creatures, board wipe that meets our qualifications? Yeah, so like Electrickery, but you probably can't overload it. We should read the wording of Sunforger again. Overload says you may cast the spell for its overload cost. If you do, change its text by replacing all instances of target with each. Now, the way Sunforger is worded, you cast it without paying its mana cost. So I don't think you can pay alternative costs. You know what I bet? I bet Sunforger has a rule about that. So here's Sunforger. But there's probably a ruling below that explains that. Again, you may already know this. Really what I'm doing here is a teaching moment about like, this is how I would find out those things. So I'll search Sunforger, and we're back over here again. And you can see that at the bottom of the Sunforger page, it says you can't pay the cost of unattaching Sunforger unless Sunforger is attached to a creature. If you cast a spell without paying its mana cost, you can't choose to cast it for any alternative costs. You can, however, pay additional costs. If the spell has mandatory additional costs, they have to be paid. So my interpretation of that is that when it says you may cast this for its overload cost, that's an alternative cost. You cannot use overload when you use Sunforger. But again, we're trying to see if we can find something that might do a board wipe at this level. And it looks like I was wrong and there isn't. Electrickery is basically the card, but because you only get the wipe with overload. And Street Spasm would kind of work, but you can't pay X when you do it without paying its mana cost. Tricky. While we're here, I think Comeuppance isn't the worst idea. Comeuppance says, prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and planeswalkers you control this turn by sources you don't control. If damage from a creature source is prevented this way, Comeuppance deals that much damage to that creature. If damage from a non-creature source is prevented this way, it does that much damage to the source's controller. It basically just mirrors all the damage you take for a turn. This is a very different card than what we've talked about so far. Most of the things we've talked about are things that are designed to be quite broad or to hit like everything. I think that Comeuppance's inclusion would be more of a nod to aggressive decks, where I said that, you're trying to combo off, you want people to not stop your combo, that's why you should play Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast. Comeuppance would be more of a nod to aggressive decks, and you can basically just make them explode themselves. But I don't think this card is incredible. I think this card would be a lot worse without Sunforger as well. So not super excited, but while we were here, I thought we'd check. No paying alternative costs. Yep. Shall we change the search while we're here? Because these are the parameters for Sunforger. It's an instant that fits our commander's color identity. It's less than 5. And we could just keep using this search to find more cards. So we could say destroy, don't control. Nothing. Destroy each. Okay. So for example, leave no trace says destroy target enchantment and each other enchantment that shares a color with it. Would hose an enchantress deck pretty hard. Rampage of the Clans destroys all artifacts and enchantments, but it's green, so we can't fetch it. Again, I don't want to remove green from the color identity because we can play cards if they have green in their color identity. They just can't. They have to be red or white. I guess we could say including red and white, and then if we do that search again, it won't give us the green cards. But I'm always confounded by the way that part of the search works. So just give me a break here. I don't just focus on doing these for a living. What else can we do? And it feels like I'm not giving you much. The third thing that I think you should include in the Sunforger package is more or less faithless looting. But it depends what the pace of your games is. I can't really know. I don't mean to pick on your wording, Eddie Stardust, but when you say a high-powered list or that it's a very competitive environment, like it's not your fault, but there's really no possible way I can know exactly what cards would be viable in your meta. I would have to literally watch you play many games. It's not really possible. So forgive me if this seems like a weird card to recommend, but Faithless Looting, I think, is a good idea in this deck. The reason is that if you have Sunforger and you draw Pyroblast, Red Elemental Blast, you can replace those cards for other stuff. And it also means that if you get those cards normal, this is just a good card, you know. It's a pretty powerful card filtering spell. It does mean that you have to pay 1 mana and slow down. When that mana could have been spent on something like an Avacyn's Pilgrim for a deck like this, yeah, that doesn't sound that good. But I do feel like a spell like Faithless Looting feels like a good add for a deck like this. Earlier, something you said, which is kind of the secret fourth category, is can we replace more of the stuff that is currently green spells with white and red spells that you can get with Sunforger? And there, I think for a lot of them, obviously you shouldn't. Like you should play Veil of Summer, probably, if you're playing this kind of deck. And you can't get it with Sunforger, but it doesn't really matter. It's a good enough card that you should play it anyway. Teferi's Protection and Deflecting Swat, like these are cards that I would definitely play anyway. You shouldn't, you know, you can get them with Sunforger, but that's not why they're in here. Sunforger is the trick of this deck is that it's a pretty minor part of the deck. There's no obvious way to fetch it out that I can see. And not having a lot of, like equipment synergy in the deck. There isn't any clear way to repeatedly fetch it. Now, with stuff like Stoneforge Mystic, though, you could make a deck that was more focused on that. You could say, you know, Marath can be good if you give it a little bit of, if you give it other stats, like things like Basilisk Collar or Illusionist Bracer, sure, and activated ability, Doubler. In fact, these equipment do have really good synergy with Marath, so maybe it's worth building the deck more into equipment synergy stuff, adding in something like Faithless Looting, playing some very hardcore ramp, and setting up a bit of an engine with Sunforger might be good. Like it might be better to tutor for more stuff. Another card that comes to mind is that card that lets you tutor for an equipment, but I don't remember what that is called. So let's search equipment, I typed. And I told Eddie Stardust this before we agreed to do this parlay, but this is definitely a case where you're seeing like this format makes it quite challenging to do a lot in just a half hour. You know, I'll go for a little bit longer, but it's quite difficult to make that number of changes to a deck for good, like for actual reasons. with this amount of time. It looks like the card I was thinking of is a sorcery. But yeah, something that could like tutor for an equipment that seemed relevant. Things that just let you fetch equipment seem relevant to me. Like fighter class seems sort of all right. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for an equipment, put it in your hand. The level 2 makes equip abilities cost 2 less, which is really good with Sunforger. So it seems like a pretty good little package, and you probably won't expect to cast level 3. But this is a lot of mana. 5 mana total for the tutoring for the equipment, and then making equip abilities in general cost less. But if you use Sunforger 3 times, this would pay for itself. 2 times, and it almost pays for itself. So I actually don't think it's that bad. I feel like that's still pretty good if you intend to focus more on Sunforger. Really, what I'm actually into in this deck is we just need maybe just more card draw, like just adding more draw effects. So let's do a little recap because we're not going to be able to do we're going to be able to completely overhaul the list, but let's give some more targeted advice. I think Mana Tithe should go in. I think Faithless Looting should go in. I think that Generous Gift, Chaos Warp, and Beast Within are suspect in this type of deck. I'm not saying they should go out, but I would keep an eye on are those really the spells that you want in that slot? I don't know, but protection effects, having removal that can protect your stuff, counter spells, seems like the better route for this type of deck. Three main things come to mind for adding stuff: board wipes, things that kind of like synergize with Sunforger or enable Sunforger, like a spell that creates tokens feels relevant. And then three is Faithless Looting, but I also want to suggest like equipment synergy creatures, things that are not Sunforger spells, to just get you it more often because this deck feels like it's kind of on the edge of doing that. It's almost a deck that constantly pulls out Sunforger, and it seems like you have other equipment that are very frequently advantageous to use. So something like fighter class to tutor for them, even more equipment enablers, like maybe pure steel paladin. There's not that many artifacts in here. Um, but really, where that's going is more card draw too. Do you want the card draw as Sunforger package stuff? And I think the answer is no. I kind of want maybe cantrip creatures. Looking at the list, a lot of the creatures you have are like a mana dork, a hate bear, basically. Small, medium-sized creatures that inhibit the opponent's ability to progress very much. Even Mind Sensor, classic one. Most of these cards are either hate pieces, like they slow the opponent down and get you some advantage, or ramp. So yeah, like I think some of them, for example, Destiny Spinner, makes me think, do you want this to be card like if this was not Elvish Mystic, but um that 2 mana 1/1 elf that draws a card when you play it. That I almost want that here. I like this card by the way. Creatures and enchantment spells you control can't be countered while it's in play, and then it lets you animate lands to make them do the big damage. Based on enchantments you control, this deck isn't very enchantment heavy, but um, I'm not against this card generally. I'm just not sure it's the most urgent need to fill. I guess kind of the fun thing about commander or deck building this way is that that's what it boils down to, right? Is like what is the most urgent need to fill. I feel like in this deck it would be board wiping a little bit. I'm quite worried about the amount of creature based removal. I don't think you want this much of it to be creatures. So for example, like good old this has nothing to do with Sunforger. Good old rampant growth should definitely be in here, in my opinion. I think that this deck has too much of a focus on creature-based ramps, such that if you get board wiped, this deck does very little. And there's some protection against that, but not as much as you are dead if you get board wiped. If people don't play that in your metagame, that's one thing, but I don't think it's bad to include more of. The counterspell cards kind of protect against that, sure, But you don't want to be pulled in too many directions and have to always use all of those only to not have all your stuff killed, but then when you do your combo, you lose. So again, I feel like more card draw is also warranted, or something um, that gives you more card draw and ramps you. Is that a card? Maybe it doesn't match my filters. But there is a creature that's like 3 mana for a 2/2 that taps for to add 1 mana to your mana pool, and you draw a card when you play it, I believe, which is overall not a very powerful card, but in this deck it kind of feels like maybe what you'd want. Um, I don't know. I think that that's the big thing that comes to mind is I would actually want to add a lot of things that are not Sunforger stuff around Sunforger to make it go. Another thought, this is a little weird, is you might put manlands in to some extent. I'm not sure which ones. The classic one everybody always mentions is something like Inkmoth Nexus. But any manlands, really. The idea with these would be, that's Blinkmoth, would be that they can hold the equipment so you can unequip it even if you get board wiped. These would be insurance so that if all your creatures get killed, you can still equip the Sunforger to stuff. And then that would be a way to kind of get you out of that situation. You could pull up your Sunforger piece that makes tokens or whatever needs to happen, um, and rebuild your board a little bit or get some card draw. Now, another thought is if we can find any ramp that is red or white. So if we can do another search and find anything that lets you put lands onto the battlefield that is red or white instead of so I'm just going to do color identity red and white. The cost is going to be equal to less than 5. And it's got to be an instant. And it's got to be legal animal commander. And we'll say search library land battlefield. So no. Although exile all attacking creatures target player controls, and they search for that many lands. I don't know if you want to play this, but that's something. Something that lets you ramp. It's not going to be an instant. That's the problem. Like there are cards like that, but they're sorceries, and a lot of the red one or the white ones tend to be you put, if your opponent has more lands than you put them into play. But I do think that land-based ramp would be useful in here, like belongs in here to some extent. Let's just keep looking around a little bit more. You have a lot of tutors, that's something. So you can find the things that get you the Sunforger pretty quick, but that's a long chain. There's got to be a ton of value coming out of it. So maybe you should focus on the Sunforger thing more. That just seems like if that's a thing that is viable in your games, we definitely don't have to worry too much about the competitiveness level, because that's like you're paying close to 10 mana before it's paying off at all. That's a lot. Which is why I want them to be bigger spells, but as you've seen, there's not that many. Let's see if can we get a board wipe? Destroy creatures. I just want a board wipe. Defend the campus. No. Retaliate. Destroy all creatures that dealt damage to you this turn. You could play Comeuppance, like I suggested before. Not exactly the same thing, but destroy all blocking creatures and all blocked creatures. I don't think that's the worst idea, but that would be more like an opponent attacks an opponent, which that's not a bad idea. But yeah, so I'm quite surprised to find that there's that few board wipes available that you could just fetch. I guess that helps balance it, and it's because they're instants, right? I don't know. That's hard. But yeah, a lot of these, the primary thing on my mind is just I'm not sure what else to add if it's not. You could play a spell that just does damage to a lot of targets, like that one, not Arc Bond, although let's look at Arc Bond. This is an instant. Yeah, I mean, Arc Bond is 3 mana for a red instant. It says choose target creature. Whenever that creature is dealt damage this turn, it deals that much damage to each other creature and each player. So usually you can easily make this into a board wipe. Um, this is probably close to the best you're going to get. And I think this is a good card anyway. Yeah, put this in for sure. Again, I think it might seem awkward because it kills a ton of your ramp stuff. But that would be another criticism I would have. I want to add more ramp um, that isn't creatures. And occasionally, I think it will make sense to wipe them. You do have a bit of protection too. Like you could play Teferi's Protection, Heroic Intervention, with something like that, so your stuff doesn't die. But yeah, I without understanding that much better, I guess we could look through some of the cards that you recommended too before we go. Let's do that. I'll move over here and do the hokey pokey, and let's look at those. A braid. I like the idea. It's 3 damage to target creature, or you destroy an artifact as an instant. I think you're right not to include it. I think both effects are just too weak, and I would kind of rather have something like Chaos Warp that just it's 1 more mana, but it just gets rid of anything. Whereas this only definitely gets rid of one type of permanent. Um, but 3 damage is enough to kill him, Anyway, Chroma's Will. Creatures you control gain lifelink, indestructible, protection from colors, all colors. If you control your commander, you can do the other one, which is Flying, Vigilance, Double Strike. You can pick one, you get both if you have your commander. So another protection spell, and it could be used to be aggressive. I think it's that your deck maybe doesn't value the first mode that much, so it being 4 mana when you don't use it with Sunforger just isn't, it's not good enough. Angel's Grace, this isn't a bad idea. Another card that I can't believe hasn't come up yet. Is this card not in here? Yeah, I feel kind of bad for not saying this sooner. Silence. Hell yeah, Silence. Where's Silence? Yeah. This is like the biggest card of all time for this deck. You gotta play Silence. Your opponent can't cast spells this turn. Also, maybe Angel's Grace. You can't lose the game this turn, and your opponents can't win the game this turn. Until end of turn, damage that would reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. Maybe definitely play Silence. Remember that because this goes on the stack, people can cast spells in response to it, but you can play it at a time when, like, if they had to go for it right then, it would be really bad. Like, play it during their, draw step or something. Um, I'm not an expert on this card. People are, and you can look up, good advice about it. But yeah, that Silence is a definite recommend. All right, let's keep going a little bit. These are creatures, but I'll just quickly look at what they're doing. It's a Hate Bear. Artifact mutation destroys an artifact, and you make tokens equal to its mana value. I think this is a very good card. Again, I think this is nice because it generates tokens. It is green, but it is also red, so Sunforger should be able to fetch it. And yeah, it gives you bodies to hold a Sunforger. It gives you a way to kind of do that. A board wipe is coming. You could... Oh no, that'll resolve first and then they'll still die. But I like this card. I like the idea of this card. I'm much more keen on this than something like Generous Gift, because you'll always have an artifact to target, and I think giving your deck the bodies, like a way to get back bodies, sounds good. Atarka's Command. I like modal spells with Sunforger a lot. This is choose 2. Your opponents can't gain life this turn. Atarka's Command does 3 damage to each opponent. You could put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. Creatures you control get 1/1 and reach until end of turn. This kind of gives you ramp, but I don't think the other modes are good enough in your deck. The land card from your hand onto the battlefield seems like an effect you want here. I was saying if we can find some ramp in that Sunforger can fetch that isn't creatures, as an instant. So I like that idea, but I don't think the other effects are strong enough. I'm not sure you'd feel that good about Sunforgering literally just for that one effect. Your opponents can't gain life this turn, yeah. And the 3 damage to each opponent that's not really enough. Creatures you control get 1/1 and reach, it's kind of a toolbox, but I think that's a bit narrow. Note that adding like Faithless Looting would definitely help make that more robust. Aura mutation, this is more or less artifact mutation, but for enchantments, yeah, pretty good. Um, Boros Charm. I can't believe I didn't think of Boros Charm. It's even Sunforger is Boros. Yeah, definitely play this. This is great. The double strike can come up and get you some clutch, maybe lifelink. You have Basilisk Collar in here, but most of the time it's permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. It's just a really cheap, usually heroic intervention or Teferi's protection. You get another of that effect, which I think is fantastic. I'm totally for Boros Charm. Exile all graveyards. This might feel a little narrow. What I don't like about cards like Calamity's Wake in here is that you don't have a lot to do with them if their very narrow hosing condition isn't met. What I like better about things like Artifact Mutation or Aura Mutation is that they're usually going to be pretty good. They're only sometimes not what you want, or like Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast. They're they counter something that is a great threat to you. If that thing isn't in the game, I would argue you can afford to have them not be that effective a card. And then if you do have Faithless Looting, then you also might be able to recycle them. Whereas I feel like this it's got too high a chance not to do anything at all, and the payoff isn't high enough if it's good. I'm much more keen to play something like Relic of Progenitus that can exile all graveyards and replaces itself. It draws you a card if you don't need it that bad, basically. Um, yeah, this just seems a little narrow. Comeuppance was in here, nice. Uh, Chance for Glory. Creatures you control gain indestructible. Take an extra turn. At the beginning of that turn's end up, you lose. I feel like in these colors, you have enough of these effects that you probably don't need to play this one. So I'm not that high on it, but Dawn Charm. Again, we're just browsing to see if I can help more. Deflecting Palm. I think this is a little expensive for what it does. Basically, just redirects a source of damage for 2 mana. I think this can be kind of clunky removal. Dragonlord Jermaka's and kind of a hate bear thing. Jermaka's command. Prevent all damage and instant or sorcery would do. Sacrifice an enchantment. Creatures fight. For only 2 mana. Yeah. So I like this one because it is fairly likely to destroy at least 2 cards, and they could target different people. You fight something and kill it, and you make someone sacrifice maybe their only enchantment. I'm much more high on something like Dromaka's Command, which can also prevent damage dealt by spells. That could save you. I'm much more keen on that than, yeah, like Generous Gift and Beast Within in this deck. Again, I think that the utility really makes a difference. Eldamari's Call, probably yes in this deck. Being able to just get any creature, that seems really good. You have many cards that more or less do this, although they put it onto the battlefield, but this doesn't charge you much of a surcharge for putting it in your hand. Gruel Charm, I don't know. The gain control of permanents you own is a thing, and it's 3 damage each creature with flying with instant speed. So yeah, you can see how an approach to this deck where you play a bunch more narrower spells, but also some looting, you discard and then draw, might create a toolbox where you had more, a lot more options. So I'm kind of interested in that approach. Is Harmonize an instant? Jessica's Will's not an instant either. No. Oh, but you have to play them. I got excited about the idea that you could get the double face cards that have a land on the back with Sunforger, but you have to play them. If you get them back from your graveyard to your hand, you get Kabira Takedown with Sunforger, and then you use Eternal Witness to put it back in your hand and play it as a land. Yeah, what are you doing there? It's crazy. Lightning Helix, Lightning Bolt, probably yes. I just think it's versatile enough. Again, I think that Path of Exile and Swords to Plowshares are likely just so efficient that they probably should be in here. Oh my god, there's way too many. Master Warcraft. I'm just quickly trying to skim them. Counter target spell that targets a permanent you control. Yes, good. Return to Dust is the card I was thinking of at the beginning of the video. I like this because you can, it's an instant, So you get it with Sunforger, but if you activate Sunforger's effect during your main phase, you exile 2 artifacts or enchantments, and you exile them. You not only hit 2 targets, but you also fully exile them. And again, you're likely paying less than 4 mana because Sunforger. I think this card is normally not that great. Not bad, not great, but pretty not bad in a Sunforger deck. So I'm gonna say yes to this one. Settle the Wreckage came up earlier. I really like these modal double face cards, but it depends on your format whether they're fast enough. Like the tapped land might be a death sentence if it's too competitive a level of play. Wild Ricochet, big yes. The final thing I want to say before we go is that I think the redirect target of spell cards are more or less counterspells and thus pretty good. So we're talking about things like, or even if they double the spell, something like Shunt, I think it's called. Change a target of target spell with a single target. Target. Good. Yes, good. There's a lot of variants of this, and I think that they're mostly pretty good. I think this is one of Red's really underrated forms of interaction. Note that target spell, that could be a lot of things. That could be an aura. That could be an instant or sorcery. That could be an aura that you could steal from someone. Stuff like that. But mostly, yeah, it will end up being a counterspell. You could make a counterspell target itself or shunt, for example. You could make a burner removal spell target something else that you don't care about getting removed. I think these are very good. I think if you're looking for versatile effects like that, this is on the list. So that was a whole bunch of recommendations. I hope that actually helped. Again, I didn't worry about specifically changing every little thing. If I had done that, you would have gotten a lot less recommendations and logic and a lot more of me just fiddling with exactly what gets cut and what gets added. And I thought that it was more valuable to give you this instead. So I hope that was okay. It was a little longer than usual because I'm not really used to this form and I had to figure some stuff out. But I hope that kind of helps. Without a vascular understanding of the deck, I hope enough of that advice was usable. But yeah, it looks cool. Again, I think that for this deck, the direction for the Sunforger package might want to be focused more on equipment and non-creature ramp, so you can enable it more. Like you're a little more versatile against your creatures getting blown up, but you also have more ways to get Sunforger, so when you have them, you're good. Man lands, stuff like Faithless Looting to replace very specific cards. Anything that's something like a counterspell, I think is very, very good with Sunforger. Anything that could put land into play. Arc Bond as a board wipe, that was one of the better ones we found. Even like Gruul Charm does the 3 damage to creatures with flying. Like that's all right. And again, if you had more Faithless Looting effects, you could get rid of those. Yeah, a lot of good stuff overall. But I would definitely significantly change it. And I might consider less, more card draw as well. I'm not sure what kind. Getting it with Sunforger would be cool, but again, I think if you focus that much on that, the deck should definitely take some steps to get Sunforger more often. You do have all the like green tutor stuff. You've got Finale of Devastation, Court of Calling, and Green Sun Zenith. So you can use those to pull for, a card that might get you your Sunforger, but not all of those can get you a green, non-green creature. So you can't just get a Stoneforge Mystic and then get a Sunforger every time. But maybe the deck would be good if you did do that. At that point, maybe it should be a Sunforger deck. I don't know. I hope I helped. If you want a parlay like this, I will try to slim them down a little. This one got a little long. But yeah, I'm new to them. And if you want other kinds of parlay like you've heard on this channel, to have you, details are in the description. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the request. Eddie, it was outside my comfort zone, which was exhilarating. I hope that doesn't sound too negative. It was fun.